My name's Chris Heward. I'm the Head of Wetland Research at the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, and I'm joined by Charlie Mellor, who's Head Keeper at the Norfolk estate in West Sussex. We're going to give an overview of what is known as the Southern England Curlew Project. So rather than repeat a lot of background information about curlew declines and head starting, I'll try to focus just on the specifics of this project and the things that make it different to other head starting projects in the UK. So obviously all the different head starting projects are using different release sites. I'll tell you a little bit about ours. Later on I can show you some photos of the habitat, tell you a little bit about the management of those sites. Another big difference with our project is the source of donor eggs. So where most British head starting projects currently take eggs from airfields, so they're taking eggs from nests that would have to be destroyed because they pose a risk to aircraft. Our donor eggs come from nests in the Yorkshire Dales, so those are nests within stable populations of curlew, but one element of our project is to try and understand what effect egg removal might have. Another element of our project that's slightly different is the scale of our monitoring, so we're committed to the same types of post-release monitoring as the other head starting projects, but we're doing this on a slightly larger scale. I'll tell you a little bit about why that is in a moment, and I'll show you some of the results at the end of this talk. The precursor to this project was a pilot on the South Downs in 2022, and that took place on Peppering Farm on the Norfolk estate in West Sussex. And Peppering was already the site of a really successful conservation project that was working to restore populations of farmland birds. It done that by implementing lots of wildlife-friendly farming measures, removing some farmland from food production, and also by managing predators, so that was particularly beneficial for ground nesting species like Grey Partridge and Skylark. And Peppering was seen as a suitable site for a curlew reintroduction, largely because of that track record, particularly in terms of the recovery of lapwing at the site. So the recovery of lapwing was really clear during the course of that management for partridges and other farmland bird species, and it demonstrated that some of those weirder boxes were ticked in terms of food availability and good nest and chick survival. Obviously we'd expect the habitat requirements of lapwing and curlew to be different, but I think the other important thing that it shows was a willingness to tailor management to specific species. So from a head starting point of view, it showed that head started curlew would be released into a landscape that kind of met their needs already, and should those curlew return to breed, hopefully they'd stand the best chance of breeding successfully, and particular measures could be put in place if they were seen to be of value. In terms of the 2022 pilot, I'll give some details later, but the results were promising, and they were certainly promising enough to warrant continuing the project. In fact, it was decided at that stage we should extend the project to 2 new sites. Those new sites are Cranbourne in Dorset, the westernmost of those pins. We continued to release birds at Peppering in Sussex, and in the east we would release curlew in Kent on the Isle of Sheppey at Elmley. So a little bit about those release sites. The Norfolk estate is a mixed arable and chalk downland site, and as I've already described, its management is really focused on biodiversity, so it's far from typical in terms of your average farmland. It's probably fair to say it's different to most sites where curlew still remain in the UK, but the downland grassland sites would have some similarities to places like Norfolk Brecks or even some of those airfields. I'm told, I'm not familiar with them, but the arable land is similar to some sites where curlew continue to breed on the continent in Europe. The Norfolk estate sits between 2 rivers, and these offer water meadow habitats within a commutable distance, so it lies between the River Arun and the River Ada. Cranbourne in some ways is very similar to Peppering. It largely consists of arable farmland, but arable farmland with an atypically high proportion of wildlife-friendly AES habitats, so it'll be much more diverse in terms of flora and fauna than a typical arable landscape. And similarly, it's interspersed with chalk downland, so it borders Martin Down Nature Reserve, and it has grazed downland of its own. There's also riverine meadows close to the release sites. Cranbourne also includes an area of heathland at Cranbourne Common, and this is a site where curlew have bred as recently as the 1990s. So of our 3 sites, it's the one with the most recent record of curlew breeding, and it's also also the closest to existing curlew breeding populations. It's not far from the New Forest, and there are still curlew breeding on some of the Dorset heaths. And finally, Elm. Elm is perhaps least typical. It consists of coastal grazing marsh and is managed as a privately owned nature reserve, and it supports huge numbers of breeding waders. So across 3,300 acres, there'd be between 300 and 400 breeding pair of lapwing, and there'd be about 400 pairs of breeding redshank. There's other additional species like avocet. And in terms of habitat relevant to curlew, there are areas of dry or raised grassland which are currently managed as hay meadows. And those are the sort of areas perhaps we'd most likely expect curlew to use in the future.
Hi there, Charlie Mellor. I'm the head keeper on the Norfolk estate. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the eggs. So basically, we collect on a number of northern estates in the Yorkshire Dales. These are sort of predominantly sort of grouse moor with sort of low-lying white ground and grassland. We employ 2 people for a month or 2 who basically spend their time looking for nests, ideally vulnerable nests sort of near public rights of way or silaging areas, and we collect the eggs from here over a period of a few weeks. These are then monitored, kept in incubators up north, and then when they're sort of coming close to their hatching period, we believe that they travel better when they're sort of nearer to hatching, because obviously the sort of the embryo is sort of a bit more advanced. So we bring them down within a week of hatching. Generally, they come down in purpose-built travel incubators, which are sort of like a warming cabinet with foam inserts. So the eggs are kept sort of pretty still. They're then turned by hand on the way down by someone who's sat in the back of the Discovery, and we get them down here and put them straight into our incubators. We have 40 eggs, and then another 40 go on to Cranbourne and another 40 on to Elmley. The first eggs start hatching after about a week, or maybe a couple of days actually, and then after about a week we've probably had all 40 hatch out. We have at Peppering we have 3 different sort of incubator setups. So we have our Arcom incubators, which we put the eggs in to begin with. As soon as we see the first sign of pip, the eggs are moved into a hatcher where they're not then moved, not then turned. They're kept, the temperature's dropped slightly in the hatcher and the humidity put right up, and we seem to have pretty good results with this. Once the chicks are hatched, we then move them into a third incubator, which is very low humidity and slightly lower temperature, and this is where we just dry them off. So they're in here for 3 or 4 hours. Once they're completely dry, then they start going into the tubs under the infrared lamps, and the rearing process starts. So moving on to the rearing process, we start the chicks off from sort of day one. They're in little rectangular tubs, and we put them on vet bed. This is very grippy, they can walk about on it without slipping around, and they have a tray of the high protein sort of micro pellet and a drinker and an infrared lamp set at the right height. And we generally put about 5 to 6 chicks in each tub. What I try and do is as the eggs start pipping, I put them in clutches of 4 in the hatcher, so that generally when one starts hatching, the others seem to hatch at the same time, and then I move that clutch of 4 into a tub with maybe 1 or 2 extras, and that's almost like a clutch. So they stay in these tubs for about 3 or 4 days. Then they go in some bigger, rounder tubs with like EcoBoard, which is like a sort of cardboard bedding. This seems to work quite well. It soaks up the moisture if they flick the water out of the drinkers and that kind of thing. And what we've started to do, we had a few problems in 2023 with the proteins, protein levels and stuff like that with the food. So what we tend to do is keep them on the very high protein for a week, and then I actually drop the protein right down to the 20%. They probably grow slightly slower, but we then tend to have less problem with angel wing and droopy wing. So after about a week, as soon as they're sort of pretty strong, they then go into the outside rearing field. And outside we have plastic sort of huts with an infrared lamp in, and we start them off with like a bower on the front, so they've got a small area of grass to go onto. But we find that very, very soon they're wanting to be out of here, and we tend to give them as much room as we can as early as possible, actually. And we find that the more room they have, the better they do. We then keep them on 20% food until they're sort of past the feathering period, and then we whack the protein right up for the last probably 2 or 3 weeks, just to give them, put as much weight onto them as we can before we release. Now onto the releasing period. We generally start looking at releasing birds after about 50 days. They've been on the field. We've given them more and more room, and we keep the first probably quarter of the pen mown short. The rest of the run we just let it go wild. We keep round the outside. We keep it mown so that the chicks/poults can get all the way around. But apart from that, we leave it to go rough, and they seem to love hunting for insects in amongst the nettles and the grass and all that kind of thing. So from 50 days onwards, we start monitoring the birds with the GWCT, and any birds that are big enough and suitable enough for release, we start putting out in the release pens. At peppering, we have separate release pens in nice areas on the downs. We've got one right by a large dew pond, which they seem to really like. Another one in a nice area of sort of rough chalk grassland. Cranbourne and Elmley have done it slightly differently. I think Cranbourne released some on an area of heath, and then the rest of theirs they actually released from the rearing pen, which in my opinion is actually a lot less stressful for the birds if you can do it that way. And I think Elmley have released all theirs from the rearing pens.
So from eggs to curlew release, the project generally has around a 75% success rate. You see in 2003 the rate was substantially lower, but that was something that was experienced by all headstarting projects. Across the board in 2023, everyone suffered with issues related to feather and wing condition. We know now really that was caused by the food that all projects have been using. For 2 of our sites, this was the first year of rearing curlew. So for Cranbourne and Elmley, it was a really difficult first year. It was quite demoralising. Thankfully, we've really bounced back in 2024. Release rates are back where they should be, and it's been much more successful, much more encouraging. All of our curlew are metal ringed and colour ringed prior to release, and a proportion of them are GPS tagged. In fact, we're hoping to GPS tag around about 30% of the released birds, so higher than other head starting projects. This is one of the potential benefits we want to deliver as a research project. The hope is that will provide information that will be relevant and of value to other head starting projects, both those that exist now and those in the future. So one of the first things we want to understand with our tracking data is the survival in the period immediately after release. We tended to find that mortality was relatively high in the first kind of week to 10 days, but after that, survival was really, really good. So birds learn natural predator avoidance behaviours. Most of the mortality, if not all of the mortality in that period, was associated with predation and usually with birds of prey, but that might be specific to our sites because they have quite high bird of prey populations, and other predators, particularly foxes, are controlled. GPS tracking is also a tool to understand dispersal away from the release sites. So birds tended to make long distance movements within about 1 to 40 days of release. So somewhere between the 15th of July and the 28th of August. Those dispersal movements tended to be sudden and made in a single flight. So over the course of 24 hours, the birds would head off in a southwesterly bearing until they hit the coast, and then they would keep travelling until they found a site that they liked. The exception to this was the birds that have been released at Elmley, because they're released close to suitable wintering habitat, and so they tended to stay close to the release sites within about 1 kilometre usually. The tracking is also telling us something about the bird's longer term survival. So slightly more than half of the GPS tag curlew are surviving their first year. So that's similar, slightly better than what we'd expect from wild birds. And we tend to find that they will settle somewhere late summer, early autumn. They will remain there through their first winter, through all of the following spring and summer, and then their second winter. And then as they're approaching 2 years old is when we're starting to see their first spring movements. So in terms of the big question, whether birds return to breed, birds that we've released in 2023 and 2024 aren't yet at the stage where we'd be expecting to see that. But we have had some interesting results from our birds that were released in 2022. So in spring 2024, 7 of those GPS tag birds from the 2022 cohort were still surviving, and 5 of them returned to Sussex. The 2 that didn't were already in Sussex, so they had spent the last 2 years at Mellor and Pagham on the south coast, close to their release site. 3 of the GPS tag birds were back on the Peperinger estate itself at some point in April or May, and we know that at least another 2 flagged but untagged birds were also back at some point during that period. Some of these curlew only returned briefly. So this is a bird that was wintering in Devon, which returned to Pagham, the coastal site close to where the birds are released. It returned to the Peperinger release site very briefly and then back to Pagham. And then following that, it made some really long wandering flights around southern England. And we're fairly certain that it was doing this with other wild curlew. It seems very likely based on the locations that it was visiting, several of which we know are associated with wild breeding populations. It did this through the end of April, early May, and then eventually returned to Peperinger, where it joined 2 other birds that had already settled on that site and which attempted to breed. And in the next slide, I'll let Charlie tell you a little bit about discovering that.
So we were all very excited when 2 of the curlew arrived back beginning of May last year, 2024, and then a third one actually turned up as well. I thought that I noticed some copulation going on between a pair, but I wasn't 100% sure. I was watching them through binoculars, and I just took my eye off for a second, and it looked like one was on top of the other one. We then saw round about the 8th of May. I took a really nice video actually of the pair doing a really nice display flight and doing the calling, And by that time, the third bird had actually disappeared. It kept coming back every now and again, but this pair had definitely sort of bonded. And I kept seeing the pair on a certain field. I used to drive past every morning, and I'd see them there. And then one day it was a single bird. And as I drove a bit further, I then noticed a pair, and I thought, well, hang on, there's something going on here. So I sat back with the binoculars and actually watched the second bird go back to an area, which I then checked and found a nest. So on the 24th of May, we found a nest with 3 eggs in. And then about a week later, she had 4 eggs, and she started incubating probably about the 1st of June, somewhere around there. And all was going very well. I used to check her every morning from a long distance through the binoculars, and she was sat quite happily. They used to share the incubation. She'd go off, we think, down to the wetland centre, which is probably a mile away, to have a wash and a feed and whatnot, and he'd take over. And then literally about 4 days before she was due to hatch, we're not quite sure what happened, but the nest failed, unfortunately. She'd come off the nest, and I spoke to Chris, who then checked the GPS data, and it turned out she hadn't been back on the eggs for 12 hours. So we checked the nest a couple of days later, and unfortunately the eggs had failed. But we were all very excited about the future, and I think we were all amazed that the breeding attempt happened quite so quickly.
All that remains is for me to thank everyone that's been involved in the project, right from the nest finding and egg collection through the rearing and all of the monitoring. And thank you to you for listening. We're happy to answer any questions.